The Collaborating Conversation podcast is for avid book readers, book lovers, and authors. Listen to this podcast as we talk more about the art of writing, stories behind books, and the hands that created them. So stay tuned and enjoy our show.
Welcome to the Collaborating Conversations podcast. Today's episode is part 4 of Foundra series Deep Dive by author Emmanuel M. Arriaga.
It's been a while since we did last time. Since we went into part 3. For part 4, I guess we discussed previously that you're setting up the audio. You're looking for an actress or actress or actor or voice actor, however you want to describe, to re-record your second book. Why don't you go ahead and describe that process of finding a good actress or actor, and what qualities are you looking for?
Yeah, so we're setting up to the second book was published earlier last year, and right now I'm working to find an audiobook producer and voice actor or actress, and I spent a lot of time doing creating very detailed audition files. So like the one that I did for this specific audition cycle, I had snippets from about 4 different scenes, and the snippet, it was focused on the internal dialogues that Lanrette does, as well as a scene that required use of voice effects, because that was one of my required things, was to actually do some voice effects for the Relish Kel, because I wanted them to be these otherworldly beings, and so it was important to that they didn't just sound like a normal character, and then just typical dialogue.
A couple questions there, follow up. When you're looking for an actor to do the parts, you do request that they can do some effects. Are you trying to keep in contact with the first book? Because I know that was something that you had done as well. However, it sounds like it also is just part of the character. And is that typical for audio voice actors to do effects, or is that atypical?
It depends. Some books don't really need them, but for my book, I've always been interested in doing voice effects, especially because there's telepathic communication. So whenever telepathy is used, I wanted to distinguish that from regular dialogue. The Relish Kel, like I mentioned before, they're supernatural, otherworldly beings, so wanted them to sound inhuman. And then some of the other villains and side characters, like they might have like the Serah from book 1, which were the minions of the Eshgren. I had some voice effects done for them as well, and so I think it makes sense in my book because of a lot of the different variety of characters, to distinguish some of those specific characters. I actually had one guy audition for the first book a long time ago who really went all out with the special effects. He had audio of Nevin when he was inside the BRS frame, which is this massive mech armor. He actually did audio that was like mech audio, it was pretty good. Had battlefield effects. He was pretty solid. The issue that I had with him was that he refused to do certain types of scenes. He's just he wasn't comfortable doing adult scenes or different things like that, and so it's just you can't just cut out portions of the book. And it's not uncommon for some voice actors to be that way. I actually just had one voice actor ask me if there was any adult content in the second book, and I was just like, well, there's scenes of people, being intimate in some way or another, and they're just like, all right, I'm going to pass, which is fair. Some people, don't want to work on that type of content, which is fine. But yeah, that was the one thing that, voice effects, and I think it also distinguishes the quality of the voice actor. If they can do some voice effects, it means that they have some pretty good skills. It means they have a pretty good setup for recording. And so, they're usually higher caliber than your typical voice actor.
Which does add cost, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, typically they don't add additional costs for voice effects. It's just like their rate, in general, might be a bit higher than, say, a voice actor who's not very experienced.
But you expect a little higher quality and a little bit technical. It's quite fascinating how more and more things are becoming. Some technical skills are more required for certain jobs and certain roles. Is it pretty common for? Do they give you reasons, or you don't really care what the reasons are for not doing adult content? It's more of, hey, if you don't want to do it, that's fine, but it is required for this book.
Yeah, I mean, they'll just say like, I don't do that, and I'm just like, all right, that's fine. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a very good reason. Some people probably for religious reasons or other stuff. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's, not going to work for you. It's not going to work. It's nothing against them. They're probably great. Just you wrote it in the book for a reason, right?
Yeah, one thing that actually is quite common is people might for those types of people, they might actually say like, oh, I don't do swear words. So like if there are swear words in the book, I won't do it. Which is fine for me because I don't use swear words in my books. And I actually created, in the second book, swear words that were native to the universe that don't actually mean anything, and so like, and so the characters will say these expletives, but it's not like an actual expletive. It's like the, native, it's like in Battlestar Galactica when they would say frack, right? It's like,
that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, but like a common one in the Foundra universe, starting in book 2, is Vusk, VUSG, and so that's a common expletive that's used, and I did some research to like find out how to make like a good expletive. So it's like, how and so there's similarities to like the punctuation and in how it's said and things like that, but it means absolutely nothing, right? Like it has no meaning in any language except Foundra.
And once you read the book, you're never gonna not say it. Just like everyone who watched Battlestar Galactica is now says frack whenever they can.
Yeah, and it's funny. I actually implemented it based off of feedback from a friend of mine. He actually he said his specific dialogue was around Dexter, because Dexter's like this gritty assassin type, who grew up on the streets, is very like, he's a sentinel, right? And so my friend told me, he's just like, it's very weird for you to have this character who is this archetype, and like he never swears. It's just like because he's like this wisecracking like gritty person, and so it's like there's some validity to that. And so in book 2, like Dexter swears like a sailor, right? But it's all it's these made up words.
How does that affect continuity though, since he didn't do that in the first book?
I mean, it's
character development.
Yeah, there you go. I think it's it doesn't really, I think it just brings more to his character in the second book. And there are some characters who swear and there are some who don't, right? So like Nevin, for example, his character was very much, not the type of character who swore. He had some belief structure and morals, that kind of prevented him from doing certain things in the first book. And so in the second book, like, you'll never see him swear, right? Even though like a lot of characters around him do. And so it actually is interesting because it adds a dynamic into the universe that I hadn't thought of before, And so it actually, I think it helps bring the book to life a little bit more. Because it's an easy thing to like switch on. So like, the second book deals a lot with space pirates, specifically Het Rastat, which is this notorious band of space pirates. And every single member of Het Rastat swears like a pirate, right? And so it actually helps bring some of the characters to life in ways that I hadn't thought of before. But it's not actually saying real swear words. So I'm comfortable doing that, but it does allow me to bring the universe to life a bit more.
Excellent. I know that some people might find that odd, like depending on your audience, you're okay with an adult content scene, but not okay with swearing. That seems like not a contradiction, but seems like a very interesting line. As an author, do you have to sometimes forget about your own morality when you're writing the characters, or when you're deciding what to put in and not put in?
I don't think so. I think, it's like, sex is not something that's bad. Like, it depends on the context, right? And so I think, and so I don't feel like it's, a bad thing to have characters who do it in that context, right? But, depending on the context, like, you may feel a different way around that character, right? But swearing, I think, is one of those things where at least for me personally, like, that's a value that I have. So I don't swear in real life, so I wouldn't write a book where people are swearing. So it's just something that I struggle with. When I was in college, I used to swear like a sailor, and so I gave that up. It's not something I want to go back to.
I totally understand. I know, at least for me, different seasons will be more Serah-like, and other seasons will be more Saint-like. Just depends on what's going on, and I flip-flopped a little bit a few times. Interesting thing about being a human, we can change our minds, and sometimes we're okay with something, and then, we're like, I'm no longer comfortable with this anymore.
Yeah.
Do you find that fun to develop your character and kind of give them different morals than what you yourself would do, or do you find that a difficult process?
No, I mean, I absolutely do. And it's actually I would say my characters come alive to me. I might have mentioned this before in previous deep dives, but one of the things, with the characters, when I'm writing a character, that character kind of writes themselves. Like, it's actually a weird experience because they come alive on the paper, and, you kind of get in their head and, react in a way that they do that might contradict a way that you would normally react. But, you're bringing that character to life, and you just kind of letting that character be that character. And yeah.
Where do you get a lot of inspiration for your characters? Friends, family, different situations?
Yeah, I think it's something we talked about before. I think it's very, characters are a mix of different ideas. Sometimes they might be based off of a real life person, but, it's the inspiration for, not a mirror of that person.
Just different quality traits depending on what you're looking for the character to develop. When you're developing a character, do you kind of, I think we mentioned this before in one of the other dives, you kind of do a D&D sheet. Is that how you determine which traits, like some genetic traits are more prone than others? Is that how you determine, like, what percentage of this trait will be active during this time? Or, like if they're typically a passive person, but this one thing makes them extremely angry, so this is the situation they'll get extremely angry and yell and rage.
So this is actually a really complicated topic. So the way I start is each character, there are three components to every character. So there's the species. If we look at all the different species, so we have the Darbol, the Dosfin, the Hoxum, the Kentar, the Husians, the Jun Sorrenta, which are introduced in book 2, the Kuven, the Lexameni, which are all introduced in book 2, and some of those are talked about, but they're not really seen until like book 2 or book 3, which is in progress. The Tuzan, the Uri, Vampire, Irritine, and Human. Irritine are introduced in book 2. And so it starts with the species. So like, what's the species character type? And each I have a detailed character species sheet, like you would in D&D, that details out, attributes of the different species. For example, you'll have, like if I bring up
I'm currently looking up Yuri, or I forget how to pronounce her name.
which one?
URI.
Oh, the Uri.
Yeah.
So the Uri, they have, if you look at, I have a character sheet, and I think in the appendix I also put some of this information there for book one. But have different complexions and things like how they look, physical characteristics, their build, what color their blood is. Sometimes that's important. What their hair color spectrum is, eye color spectrum, how they reproduce, what their mating culture is, what species they're compatible with, a brief history of the species. Depending on the thing, they might have miscellaneous context. Like the Uri, are very tribal. And so, there's a whole tribal structure, similar to like a caste system, where the different tribes, some tribes are very powerful, some tribes are very small. What tribe you belong to as an Ori kind of dictates your standing in life, at least on Peshkana, which is the mother world, where the Ori originate from, and then there are, they're very gesture heavy species. So, they have different, and some species are like this, where they have different things that they do to signify, different things like agreement or, secrets and things like that. And so I start with, what is the species, and that kind of gives me a mental model of that character. And then I determine like what class are they, right? And then, for the different classes, that's when you get into things like, are they an Arclight, an Argent, an Ashna Maiden, which is a class introduced, a class and faction introduced in book 2, a member of the Shah, which is introduced in book 2. They're talked about in book 1, but you actually encounter Shah for the first time in book 2. Shah Hunters, which are introduced in book 2, a Siddhalith, a Seafist, Combat Seafist, Nistif, which is introduced in book 2, Redolim, Scion of Ashna, which is introduced in book 2, Sekniks, what kind of Seknik are they, Sentinel, Wolpan, so once I determine their species, then I determine what class they fall into, and that class, may help define other aspects of their personality, because each class is unique, right? So you have the cultural aspect from their species, and then you have their profession aspect from their class. And so those two combinations of things help to build the character itself. And then once I have those two things for each character, then I actually go into defining very specific things like what are their motivations, what are their let me bring this up. What their personality is like. What their history is. So a lot of times building out a bio for the character. Because it's easier to bring character to life when they have a history, and then like what their motivations are, what their goal is, what the conflicts are that they have mentally or physically even. What epiphany or revelation happens to them over the course of the journey. Whether it's one book or multiple books, and then what importance they play. And then I get into specifics around like how they look, and that's heavily influenced by their species, and so all those aspects go into creating a single character, and so it helps because I've done all this work before defining these classes, defining these species. It allows me to create some very varied characters, because I then combine those different aspects and in that specific situation, and it helps me bring the character to life in a way that would be harder if I didn't have any of those things.
After a while, is it hard to keep track of who's who or what, or do you kind of pride yourself on, for lack of better terminology, data organization of your characters, your races, your classes, your species?
Yeah, I have a master spreadsheet that is incredibly detailed, as well as detailed docs for each character, class, species, lore aspects, and so I do a lot to keep myself organized, because it's impossible at this stage to keep everything in my head, and so I end up having to go back and reference certain characters or certain things. I think all the major characters are easy, but when you start getting to some of the sub characters or the different relationships there, I map those out to make it easy to determine like who would be involved or who would be in discussion, specifically like the relationship part. Like I had to, getting into book 2, I actually had to do, I created one initially in book 1, like a relationship graph, but in book 2 is actually when I had to spend some more time on that, just because when over time you begin to develop a lot of characters, and it's important to like keep the mental model of how those different characters relate to each other, because if everyone's friends, like that's not realistic, right? And so you have to,
what, people have enemies?
Yeah, I mean, even not enemies, but just like like specifically with like the Founders Elite, for example, they don't all get along, this comes out in book 2, where and I expand on it even more in book 3, where there are conflicts that arise between them because they're people, right? And so so it's important to keep track of those relationships and what their relationships are to each other.
And then how it changes throughout the book, right? So
yeah,
make changes. Do some people grow closer or grow apart? And then so it sounds like you're kind of developing a relational database here. Keeping track.
Yeah, and in many ways I am, yeah.
So when thinking about introducing a character, do you determine whether they're going to be a new part of a current species, a new species or class, or before defining the characteristics, or do you define the characteristics first, and then from there determine, okay, based on this, they would probably fall under or be a better fit under this umbrella?
It depends. So I think if I'm developing a main character, I start with what species I want them to be first, and then what class I want them to be, and then I define a character based off of those things. If I'm like, if it's a side character or someone that is maybe in a handful of scenes, I define what role they're playing first, and then fill in like what species they are, what class they are. And so it's a little different if it's a secondary or side character versus if they're a primary character. And people may appear to be secondary characters in some books, but they're actually primary characters in later books. And so for those characters, I've spent that time going through that process, like I mentioned earlier, of fully thinking through like their species, their class, and then building their motivations and things like that. Like side characters a lot of times don't have as detailed motivations or goals or conflicts or things like that, because they may only show up in like 1 or 2 scenes, and for some characters, and I don't even one of the things that I started doing more in book 2 is if a character is playing, like if a character speaks or does more than or does or shows up in like 2 or 3 more scenes, then they get named. But if they don't, then I don't even bother naming the character or building out like a full character profile for them, because they're just so and so crewman or something like that. Because one of the things that I noticed was that for some characters, I would name characters that were maybe in like 1 or 2 scenes in the first book, and then they might not show up again, and people are just like, oh, this character's name, like, do I have to remember this person? And I realized, like, I don't, it doesn't actually add something to name random NPCs, I guess you could say,
or red shirts.
Yeah, red shirts. And so I started cutting down on that in the second book and tried to eliminate that cognitive load, because people do say, like, I've gotten some people who've written reviews who are just like, there are a lot of characters, you constantly have to refer back to the appendix, which, I think because it's a space opera, like that's still going to happen. But, I try to minimize the need to do that, only for the important characters that you should actually remember.
So, for example, if your important character is on a ship, you're going to not name the captain if he's just in that ship that one time and the ship blows up when you land or something like that.
Yeah.
Jumping back to voice acting, question I had, I realized we kind of gone down a different rabbit hole here, so this might need to be moved. Anyway, what do you do? How do you determine, when you're going through the audition process and you like some voices but you don't like one? Because I know you kind of gave us a preview, and the one voice actress you were testing kind of did a Valley Girl for Remy, and that just did not sound like her at all. I kind of struggle with that. So how do you determine if you like all the other voices or you don't like one, or do you make changes, or does that kind of after you've approved, or if you don't like a majority of them, you'll just not cast the person? Or walk us through that a little bit more.
Yeah. So like for my audition, for example, I've provided detailed voice descriptions for each character that's in the audition. And so, for the auditions itself, I'm looking more at what their range is. So like, can they do varied voices? Can they, be creative or interesting? And, or does everyone sound the same and they're not really doing that much variety? And then, when we actually start working together, like when I was working with my previous voice actress, then we get into like, the specifics of like, how does this character sound? I don't like this approach, but it's also like one of the things that's valuable with the audition phase is like when I provide, detailed notes for the character, do they actually listen to those notes or do they just not care at all? Because I get auditions from people who like they don't even try to do like the different things, the different voices or things, and I'm just like, all right, yeah, not even considering you, right? Because it's just like you're not taking my cues, so that tells me that if I were to hire you, I would have a tough time with actually getting people to follow the guideline.
As someone who listens to a lot of audiobooks, it does seem kind of surprising that they wouldn't want to do multiple voices, because that kind of seems one of the benefits of the audiobook genre is you can have multiple voices. I guess, is that kind of helpful with, your character and lore? Does that help the actor or actress who's recording kind of distinguish each character?
Yeah, something, when I worked with my first voice actress, she would actually do like an audio test for every new character. She would send me like a clip and say like, hey, is this what you were thinking for this character, like how he would sound, and I will, based off of the detailed information that I gave them, and that was actually a really valuable exercise to go through because, we course corrected a few times and just like, no, that's not how I want them to sound, or, let's switch that up. And so it's a really valuable exercise to flesh out, to make sure that each character does sound unique. I think for your faceless Richards, right? Like, for those characters, I have them do generic species accents because each species has a accent. And for those random characters, it's just doing the generic accent. Like I mentioned before, like Tuzans have British accents, right? And so it's like, anytime you encounter a Tuzan character, they're going to be talking like a British person. Anytime you encounter, a Husian or a human, they're going to have, be talking with an American accent. Anytime you encounter Vampire, they're going to have really deep voices. Ori are going to have a bit of a playful voice. So, I try to introduce these, help bring the universe to life a bit. Even just random characters at least have some type of accent. It's similar to like D&D, right? Like a dwarf is going to sound a certain way, an elf is going to sound a certain way. human and an orc are going to sound differently, right? And so it's kind of bringing that variety to the Foundra universe, and that every species sounds different from the other one.
Just how different regions have different accents. You would assume
Yeah.
in space, different locations would have different accents. Now you are limited to what the voice over artist is able to do, but that's where if you select a good one, there shouldn't be any worries.
Looking for an exciting space adventure book, a romantic young adult story, and a fantastic sci-fi read? Get The Foundra by award-winning author Emmanuel M. Arriaga today, and prepare to feed your imagination with never-ending thrill ride.
Yeah, and actually, I do, even on Thai, which is the even Thai, which is the Husian homeworld, has different accents for different areas of Thai. And I wanted to, and because a lot of the characters that you encounter in the book are Husian, because that's the primary species, in the Foundra universe, and so I added some variety even to Husians, to make those somewhat varied.
Similar to how, like, in London, you're going to have like a Cockney accent, more of a posh accent, and you can have everyone can be speaking, British English, but they can sound very different.
Yeah.
What was it like the first time you heard some of your characters kind of coming to life? Was that a fulfilling feeling? Like, how did that feel for you?
Yeah, man, I think it's a really cool experience. Even when I was listening to like the voice actor audition for the second book, like just listening to the characters and how they bring them to life was fun, right? And I've listened to the audiobook, fully through, and sometimes on the edge of my seat as I'm listening, because I'm just like, oh, this is fun, right?
Even though you wrote it, it knows what happens.
Yeah. I mean, you suspend your disbelief, right? And so it's actually interesting, and I think it's something that's really interesting as an author. And I've heard other authors talk about this too, where, if you're listening to an audiobook of like your own book, or you're reading your own book, like, you suspend your disbelief, and you're just like, what's going to happen next, right? It's just like you're the person who wrote the book, and it's just like, yeah, but what's going to happen next, right? Like you don't think about it that way when you're replaying it. You can actually enjoy it like someone else who's never, who didn't write it, right? And so I think that's something that's pretty fun and unique just about the whole experience.
Now, is there any difference? So after writing the book, you can't obviously send it to a artist or voice actor until the book is written. Do you give them a similar copy, or do you have kind of like a identification system so that they don't have to read, oh, and Remy said, or this character said that? Is it differently? I'm not sure the right wording. Does it?
Yeah, no, I understand your question. So no. So what I do is I give them the PDF version, or not the PDF, but the Kindle version, or whatever their preferred format is. Some do PDF, some do Kindle. And what they do for their preparation for the novel is they actually spend some time marking it up, and going through the process of getting ready to do it. And so they actually have a process by which they go through and prepare for the to start recording. And I think they have different techniques and approaches. You'd have to talk to an audiobook, voice actress or voice actor to get more insight into how they work. But, they definitely have their own approach to doing it, because they'll prep different sections, like they'll have cue markers for different things. Some voice actors, I've seen them, like so and so laughed, instead of saying like so and so laughed, they'll just laugh, right? And so it's like they, each voice actor is different, and they have different cues for how they bring it to life. And I think that's one of the things that distinguishes the skill level between the voice actors and voice actresses is, the more experienced, the higher cost ones, like it's a craft for them, right? Like they take your book, right? And then they they go through their process to bring it to life. And it's actually funny, like when I was working with my first voice actor, she actually marked it up because she has an English degree, and she's like, hey, I noticed, like this isn't because they look at it from like the speech perspective, so like there are sometimes things where you can write something a certain way and it's perfectly fine written, but if you were to say that same thing, that's not how you would say it. And so there were definitely instances where they would say something differently than the way it was written because it was when you're speaking at it, it's just they handle it differently. It was only a few instances, but it was definitely things I caught, because what I do is when I'm reviewing submitted audio, I have the text up on the other screen, and I'm just going through line by line as they're reading to catch any errors.
Nice. That's really cool. That's something that I've always thought of, since technology is kind of adapting and changing. It'd be very interesting if you could have a metadata tag for each character. So as artificial intelligence and other actions come over, I guess curious, as an author, would this be something you would be interested in, is having like essentially an AI that can generate different voices for each character, and then the PDF you submit has metadata and tags for each character, and then it uses different voices. Obviously I don't think it'd be to the quality of a voice actor, but if speech synthesis could actually get to human level, because as a dyslexic and someone who finds it hard to read, I would love to have more books audiofied, and so a simple like throw this PDF in this machine learning algorithm, advanced AI, and it spits out an audiobook that sounds professionally done. That would be like my kind of wet dream for audiobooks. I'm curious, is that, yeah.
It's actually technology that does that. I know is you can add emphasis to certain words to have them said in a certain way. I forget what that technology was called.
I know there's some AI in development there. I'm curious though if like that's going to become the future of writing, where you have like metadata tags, like this character said that, because I'm curious if that would make it easier for the voice actor in the future. But I guess they each do it their own way, so they're just going to read it anyway.
Yeah, I think what so, and this is what I've been able to discern, at least from the voice actors I worked with. I think when they get to characters, they have sample clips to say how that character sounds. And so, if they get to a certain character, like they'll play that sample clip to like get into the mindset of the accent that character says. And so I think they're able to quickly reference like how a certain character is supposed to sound based off of the audio that they initially recorded for that accent, because they're pretty consistent throughout the entire book, of keeping the same accent, and so that means there must be some type of
The good ones are
vocal cues or accent cues that the voice actor would use to make sure they get into the same accent, because that when you get up to like 20 plus characters, like that's skill right there.
For sure. And I know I have to do that. Like I'm not a voice actor or anything, but I every now and then will play around, and I have a decent Stewie voice, but I have to kind of, to get into that, I kind of think of Stewie saying his name, Stewie, to adjust the pitch and all that other stuff. So I definitely can relate. If you're doing like 20 different characters, you'd kind of find, and from what I've heard online, Tara Strong is one of my favorite voice actors. She does a lot of overview anime dubs and a lot of other TV shows, and she kind of talked about how she has certain triggers for certain things. Bubbles she does is super squeaky, super that, so she'll kind of do, it's very interesting. And I think, as you stated earlier, the higher quality ones are going to have better tiered versions and be more consistent. It's definitely an art form. And as an audio listener of I love audiobooks over reading, because I'm dyslexic, and I can listen to an audiobook much faster than I can read a book.
Yeah.
And if it's well produced, with each character having a different voice, or in some books they just get different actors, it definitely tells a story in a much, in my mind, more indulging way, and I can kind of suspend my disbelief a lot more than versus just reading it on a page or seeing it in a movie. But I also love the imagination that an audiobook brings, where you have to the details are filled in, but they're also not. And you're, even though you said X, Y, Z, I could see X, Y, but my Z is a little tinted a little differently than your Y or something. It's so fascinating how our minds can kind of fill in, at least for me, the overactive imagination can just pull in the story and just see the world. That's what I like about your book and your series, is your world building is so massive, and I can see the potential. You know, I've read and listened to The Expanse, the Bobaverse, Frontlines, and these massive worlds, and I can see the potential. You also mentioned you're currently starting on book 3, so is book 2 complete, or are you still making final revisions and changes?
No, book 2's published. So book 2 published last year. And so I'm about a third to a half of the way through book 3.
How do you determine the length of how long you want your book to be? Is it just until that story completes, or that section of the story?
Yeah, that's a tough question. So so I do an outline of what I want to cover in that book, because it's important to me to tell the story that I plan to tell. And so, you know, I think it's a journey to get from the start to the end, right? And there's a lot of side quests and things, or side stories in there, that build up on things that will happen in future novels, or introduction of characters, you know, who will play a role in later books. And so I think um, for for the length of the book, you know, um, they have general guidelines based off of the type of book you're writing, right? So, like, if you're writing a science fiction novel, you know, people in the industry will typically accept longer novels. So, you know, you could do 120,000 word novel, and that's like socially acceptable in the publishing world.
Is the
You know,
publisher who sets the kind of those limits and the genre? Because I have noticed that science fiction books tend to be longer, and when I'm listening to another type of book, I'm like, oh, why is this so short?
yeah, I would say science fiction and fantasy, specifically epic fantasy, are typically longer. When you get into some of your other novels, you know, 60,000 to 80,000 words is kind of the guidance there.
Is it word based
And
or, I guess,
yeah,
page based?
it's word based. And so it's, you know, 60 to 80,000. 40,000 is what you would need for a book to qualify as a novel. Anything below 40,000 words is considered a novella.
What's a
But
novella?
your average book is about 60,000 words.
What's a novella? I'm not familiar with that terminology.
It's just a short book. So basically, like, you know, much shorter than a traditional novel. A good example is the Binti series, which is a series of 3 books. Each one of is a novella. So I think they're like, you know, 20 to 30,000 words long. So they're very short books, but they're intended to be short books. You know, it's not that they're cheaper. Like, you don't pay less. You don't pay less for a novella. They're just shorter books.
I noticed. I do remember now that I'm thinking about it. The How to Train Your Dragon series were definitely shorter books, like only 3 hours per book you recorded.
Yeah, those are probably novellas. Yeah,
I think they're also young adult. I'm curious if age affects the genre or the length.
not really. So it has to do more with the genre, you know. So if it's like a romance novel, some romance novels tend to be longer. And I think if we, you know, there's general guidelines. Like, you can look it up online and see, you know, the specific, you know, guidelines for each length of novel.
That
And
also,
I know for myself, like, Elevator Quest, for example, which is a modern fantasy novel or young adult action novel, is only about 50,000 words, maybe 60,000. So it's a much shorter book, you know, and that, you know, it would make sense for that book to be 120,000 words. That would have been too long.
well, you only had so many characters left. No spoilers, but you only had so many characters.
Yeah.
That does kind of make sense with NaNoWriMo. I think that's the November writing challenge, to write 50,000 words in November. So that kind of makes sense why they picked that kind of amount, because it's close enough to being more than a novella, but actually could potentially be turned into a novel.
Yeah, so the general guidelines, let's see. So for a novel is anything over 40,000 words. Novellas 17,500 to 40,000. Novelette, which is apparently a thing, is 7,500 to 20,000. Short stories 1,000 to 10,000. And then adult fictions typically 50,000 words or longer. Young adult is 45,000 words or longer, but ideally not over 80,000 words. Middle grade, which is typically like young kids, is 22,000 words, but usually not more than 60,000. And then
What's your source for this?
I'm just looking on Kindlepreneur.
We are.
But a lot of it honestly has to do with production costs. And so it is more expensive to print a longer novel. And
So speaking of production, do you have plans for like any sort of adaptation for the screens? Whether it's say, I don't know.
Yeah, it's something I definitely want to do. It's a lot of work. And so I think one of the things that I've been working on, so there's this there are different services where you try to market your book to different producers out there. And so I've one of the things that I've been learning more about is writing screenplays, which is a different craft. It's similar to writing a novel, but it's a completely different format. You're basically writing scenes, and you're writing a scene in such a way as an actor can kind of pick up and act, right. And so with a novel, you'll write a very detailed scene, where you kind of explain the characters' emotions and how they react and respond. But when you're writing a scene for a screenplay, you don't add that level of detail because that's really for the actor to kind of bring to life, right? So you might just say like, this is the dialogue and the character in the scene is very angry, right? And then the actor actually takes that dialogue and like adds anger into it, and that shows up in how they speak and how they're acting, the things they do on the screen. And so I've actually learned a lot about, what actors do. It's actually, they're actually bringing the screenplay to life, because you don't have, you're not telling, like for example, if you're writing a scene in a book and you're writing a character who's surprised, right? Like you'll say like so and so's eyes went wide and their mouth opened and they took a step back, right? Like, and so you just explained a character being surprised. You did some showing, and so as a reader who's reading that, you go like, oh yeah, that character's surprised, and you never have to use the word surprise. You just do those actions. But in a screenplay, you would just say, in this scene, so and so is surprised, right? And so the actor actually does all those things, like they bring to life that character being surprised. So it's actually the inverse of what you're doing when you're writing a scene in a novel versus writing a screen in a screenplay, because you're partnering with the actors with that screenplay for them to actually bring that scene to life. And so it's a very different style of writing. And I'm learning more about it, but it's definitely something that I want to do. And, I'm looking to connect with people in the industry to, find outlets to bring it to life.
I guess so. You would want like a real life adaptation versus an animation adaptation.
I
guess live action instead of real life. Live action is the term.
Yeah, I mean, I would prefer. I mean, I'm open to either one. I think it would be, if it was a series, maybe something, I'd be open to animated, but, for a movie, probably live action, just because it would be very interesting to see the characters on screen. And I think sci-fi lends itself really well to live action. Because I think that's one of the things with sci-fi that I think, at least for me, like I'm more interested in watching a sci-fi movie or series that's live action, than watching a sci-fi animated thing, because I think it brings some, level of realism to like sci-fi, seeing it on the big screen versus animation, because you know I don't know, it's just, at least for me, like I prefer live action sci-fi versus animated sci-fi.
Have you watched a lot of animated sci-fi, or
I have, I've seen it. I think the difference is, when you see it in the real world, it makes it a bit more real. Um, and I think that's one of the cool things about sci-fi, is it's supposed to be like this vision for the future.
Star Trek predicted us having tablets?
Huh?
How Star Trek predicted us having tablets? Or
Yeah, I mean, one of the core aspects of sci-fi is just, you're kind of building this vision for the future. You're kind of forcing people to think forward. And at least for me, like, I don't get the same sense of awe when I watch like a futuristic animated show or anime versus when I'm watching like a sci-fi series or show with like amazing CGI, right? Like, because it's just like, that looks, like it could be in the real world, right? Like that, and that I think is the magic that sci-fi brings. It's just like envisioning what it would be like in the real world. Um, and I think that might be heavily influenced by like Star Trek and Star Wars and all those things. But I think it's just something um, that's unique to the genre, that I personally enjoy it being more live action when I see sci-fi.
so what would you want if your book was turned into a movie or a show, what inspiration would you want it to bring? What do you hope would resolve, even from just reading it? What are you hoping to bring to people's lives?
Oh, asking those complicated, deep questions. So I think it's different depending on the book. So each book is themed around different things. Like Foundra, for example, is very much this coming of age story, showing where you can be true to who you are in a world that is very different from you, right? And I explore that through Nevin a lot in Foundra, where he has these set of things that are really important for him, and he's thrust into this world that's very different from what he's known. And he's a really smart guy, he's really resourceful, but you know almost every person he meets, every situation he's put into, you know uh, is a new experience for him, and is very jarring or shocking, or something that he's not prepared for. And so book one is showing this, you know that you can be different in a world that's different from you, right? And I think that's one of the core messages in Foundra. In Pride of Ashna, it's a bit different. I think Pride of Ashna, the underlying theme there is, the world can be a terrible place, but it doesn't have to be hopeless, right? And I think, I show, this hopeless scenario, right? Like in the outer, the Pride of Ashna focuses on this character named Serah Elax, Rez Ashfallen, who is a Dasven who lost um, one of her mothers and her sister twin to a pirate raid, because her parents, Dasven are a non-binary species, so they don't have male or female, but they're typically thought to be female, and so because of certain physical characteristics, and so her family goes to the Outer Rim to try to help those people in the Outer Rim, who are less fortunate than them, and the planet that they're on just happens to be raided by pirates one day, and they kill half her family, and they are rescued by the Ashna Maidens, who are this police force in the Outer Rim who are fighting the pirates, trying to keep some sense of order, because the Outer Rim has been forgotten by all the large empires, right? Like the Husian Empire doesn't care about the Outer Rim, the Tuzan, it's just ignored by the Husian Alliance and the other alliances that are out there. And so these people are forced to fend for themselves in this horrible environment where the pirates kind of have free reign and, regularly raid and enslave, people and steal and kill. And so, Serah Elax, as this very small child, is thrown into this world. And they get rescued by the Ashna maidens, and she grows up in Ashna maiden society. And one of the things with the Ashna maidens is, in order for them to keep their policing engine going, they have very rigid requirements for anyone who comes into their territory, which is like, you must enlist your young daughters in our military faction, right? Because the Ashna maidens are this, they're basically like warrior nuns. Like they're chaste. They, they're committed to, Ashna as their goddess, their deity. So they're a highly religious society, and they are, a militaristic society. And so they believe that, Ashna has special protection for, women and women who, are chaste. And so, it leads to them recruiting by force young girls from a very young age who are brought up in this militaristic society and forced to serve, for a few years, and then, they're, and that's a requirement of any parent, right? So if you're a parent and you are rescued by the Ashna maidens and you are in Ashna maiden space, they basically tell you, if you wish to remain here, you must give up your daughter. If you do not give up your daughter, you must leave Ashna maiden space, right? Which pretty much is a death sentence, right? Because it's just like, you can go back to that planet that was just raided and is probably now run by pirates, right? And so, if you're given that choice, give up your daughter or go back to the place where you may die, you're going to do what they ask you to do, right? And so Serah Elax's mother is forced to make this decision, and she tries to get the Dasven to come rescue her, but they're dealing with other situations across the galaxy, and they weren't sanctioned to go out. The Dasven are normally very protective of other Dasven, but they where there are large populations of Dasven, they'll send like a droned armada, right, that will keep watch over that section of space. But they were just a one-off family, right, on a humanitarian mission, right, and so they weren't under Dasven protection. And so when bad things happen, the Dasven are just like, look, we'll try to help you, but you're low in the queue, right? Like we have a lot of other Dasven who are in danger that we're rushing to help. And so her mother's forced to give up her daughter to the Ashna maidens, and Serah Elax grows up in Ashna maiden society and becomes this warrior, right? Which, if you look at Dasven culture, Dasven are these peace-loving, diplomatic, humanitarian, pacifists, right? And Serah Elax is not that, right? And so that's an interesting dynamic, because that causes conflict between her and her mother. Because even though her mother lost her partner, she still believes in, Dasven. She was raised in Dasven society, and so it's hard for her to fathom, fighting, and going to war. And her daughter is doing exactly that. And so, I play around with Serah Elax in the second novel as one of the main characters, the primary main character, who ends up being this pivotal figure in the Ashna Maidens as this new villain, Sephan, who is a holdover from the first novel, starts to enact some plan in the Outer Rim. And so, the underlying story is, in this society where horrible things happen, right? Like, there is still hope there, and I think, but there are horrible things that happen, right, in the world that a lot of people don't know about, and Lenret talks about this in one of his introspective scenes in the like the Founder's Log section of the second book, where it's just like, for the average Yuzian citizen, right? Like, and there are some parallels to real life right here. You can insert Hughesian citizen as American citizen, right? Like, it's like for the average Hughesian citizen, they don't experience the hardships that other people do, who aren't in a protected space, right? Like, you don't see war every day. You don't see, brutality, right, on a daily basis. And there are people that do, right? And so, actually being aware of their plights and not being blind to those, is one of the messages in the book, and something that I think came across pretty well. And so, that I do, try to think through what the theme is, or the takeaway is for, each one of the books that I write. And there's a theme that I think of at, when I first start writing the book.
Thank you for listening. Check out our podcast on Spotify, Google Podcast, and Apple Podcasts if you enjoyed the show. For more books and inspiring stories from today's authors, please subscribe to our podcast.